everybody, and welcome to the first in our series of webinars, which will be covering the theme of data, debt, and mental health. I'm Dr. Peter Hughes, psychologist and co-founder of Cognition, and I'm pleased to welcome this morning Katie Alpin, who is the interim chief executive of a charity called Money and Mental Health Policy Institute. It describes itself as being committed to breaking the link between financial difficulty and mental health. And in the best of times, dealing with mental health and debt is a difficult, challenging problem. In the worst of times, like we're in now, with a pandemic sweeping the country, it feels like it's going to become almost insurmountable, as the problem of debt and mental health will deepen and affect millions more people. And to give an idea of how this can happen to people with no previous issues with mental health, we only need look at the case of a young Londoner, a 19-year-old London boy called Jerome Rogers, who was highlighted in a BBC documentary last year. In 2015, Jerome was hired by City Sprint to carry out deliveries. As part of the gig economy, he had no security, his pay could fluctuate wildly, but he was hugely optimistic that he could make a go of this and that he could earn himself maybe £1,500 a month. Now, the first challenge he had as part of the gig economy, he had to pay all his expenses himself, his motorbike and all other traveling expenses. Now, just as he was starting his job, his bike broke down. He couldn't fix it himself, so he decided, needing a reliable form of transport, to buy a new bike, which eventually costed him £73 a month. On the 16th of April 2015, he got a parking fine. Or in fact, it was a fine for travelling in the bus lane, a £65 fine from Camden Council. That week he earned £148.48. His expenses were £82.20, which left him £66.48, barely enough to pay the fine and leaving him with nothing to live off. That is when his problems really began in earnest. Before he paid off the first fine, he got a second fine. And the second fine was again for a similar amount. But the amount he was owing, because he couldn't afford to pay the fines, was growing. On the 28th of September, he got a notice of enforcement from bailiffs. The amount he owed was increasing drastically. By the 19th of October, he owed £512. At that point, his physical health, he suffered from asthma, began to take a turn for the worse. His mental health began to decline, along with his income. On the 20th of November, he received an enforcement notice to remove goods from his home. He now owed £789. In November and December, his gross income was only £97.33 a week. He tried to set up a payment plan, but he couldn't do it. In desperation, he paid off £5 of the debt. That didn't dent it at all. By the 10th of December, he owed £1,019. Feeling he would be a burden on his family, who were in no way well off and couldn't afford to pay the debt for him, he carried the burden himself. Eventually, his brother managed to find £500 to pay off part of the debt, but it didn't solve the problem. On the week commencing of the 7th February 2016, he took home £74.71. His expenses were £82.20 and he did an £11 fuel charge from City Sprint. On the 26th of February, he received another notice from a bailiff. And this is where the story gets even darker. On the 7th of March 2016, bailiffs turned up at Jerome's flat, clamped his bike, his only source of income. Devoid of all hope, the bailiff was the last person to see Jerome alive. The following day, Jerome's body was found in a woodland where he used to play as a child. And that is a story that's not only desperately sad, it's also a lesson to us all of how quickly somebody's life can spiral out of control, causing severe, life-threatening mental health problems. And with that, I'll now hand over to Katie, who will tell you about the important work that she does and how the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Alpin, Interim Chief Executive of the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today talking about our work. Peter's story that he opened with is a sad reminder of just how serious some of the issues we work on are at Money and Mental Health. We've been working with Jerome's family, his brilliant brother Nat and his mum Tracy, who've both become inspirational campaigners for reform of the bailiff industry across the UK, and have joined a campaign we're running at Money and Mental Health to improve the letters that are sent to people in problem debt. Today, I'll be sharing with you a little bit of that work, a little bit of the psychology behind these things, of what goes on in people's heads when they're facing the difficult combination of mental health problems and financial difficulty, and setting out some of the things we think might help. Next slide, please. Before we do that, I'll just let you know exactly who Money and Mental Health are. So we're an independent charity. We were set up in 2016 by Martin Lewis, who most of you might know as the money saving expert. His face is on the television quite a lot at the minute. In his work as a consumer advocate, Martin had seen the difficulties that being in problem debt and experiencing a mental health problem can cause, particularly when those things happen at the same time. And he set us up to try to drive systemic change to break the link between these two things. We're called a policy institute. What we mainly do is carry out research, but we try not to write reports that just sit on shelves. We're here to develop really practical policy solutions. And over the last few years, we've had some really big successes. We've transformed the regulatory approach to vulnerable customers across the UK, meaning more people get a better deal from their essential services providers, things like financial services and energy. And we've also ensured that from hopefully the start of next year, every single person in the UK who's receiving NHS treatment for a mental health crisis will also be able to freeze all their debts with no interest, no charges, and no collections activity. That will mean that people who we'd previously heard from were coming out of hospital to face bailiff letters on the doorstep, court summons, all sorts of stressful experiences, will no longer have that to worry about and can focus on getting better. Next slide. So, I thought it might be helpful to start by setting the scene of where we were before the start of the coronavirus crisis, because in truth, I know we've all seen headlines over the last few weeks about the financial difficulties facing UK households, but this isn't actually that new. We've had problems for quite a long time in the UK, and things have been getting worse over the past few years. This is looking at data back from 2013-14, so it's quite old now, but even then we were finding that a quarter of the UK workforce was financially insecure. An interesting phenomenon in the UK over the last few years has been that poverty is really no longer an issue that just affects people who are out of work. Increasingly, we have a problem with people in work in exactly the kind of gig economy, temporary, insecure positions that Jerome was in, which mean people's incomes aren't reliable and aren't enough to live on. You combine that with the benefits freeze and particularly limitations on levels of housing benefit for people who are in the private rented sector, and increasingly we're just seeing people who don't have enough money to make ends meet. One of the ways we see that is a high level of people without any savings. So 70 million people of working age in the UK have less than £100 of savings to fall on. That means if you do lose your job and your income unexpectedly, or even if something small just goes wrong in your life, as happens, about a quarter of us will have a sort of unexpected expense most years, something like the dog gets ill and needs to go to the vets, 300, 400 quid and a go. Your car breaks down, you have to take it to get it fixed. You've no other way of getting to work, 500 quid before you've blinked. Even for me, I sometimes wear glasses. If I step on those, I'm 200 quid down. It doesn't take a lot for life to go off track if you haven't got a buffer to fall back on. There are also 8 million people in the UK who are over-indebted, who already have a high level of debt and are struggling to make repayments against those. Not a great starting point, arguably. Equally, mental health is something that affects all of us across the UK at any given time. We all have mental health all the time, just like we all have physical health. And like with physical health, you can be marathon trained and ready, or you can be unwell. Say the analogue of a physical condition like having diabetes, something that really affects your ongoing well-being. About 1 in 4 people in the UK every single year experience a mental health problem. That might be something like depression or anxiety, what we'd call a common mental disorder, or something more serious. And about 2% of the population every year are experiencing a more serious mental health condition, something that's likely to be lifelong, which could be something like bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, or psychosis. This isn't just that 1 in 4 people all the time experience a mental health problem. We know that people get better from mental health problems too. But that means that over a lifetime, a very high proportion of us will experience some sort of clinical mental health problem. The current best estimates are about 50%. Obviously, when you then add in people's friends and family members, the likelihood is that most of us have been affected by a mental health problem, whether directly or indirectly at some point. So how are things looking at the moment? What are the very immediate impacts of the coronavirus crisis we're seeing? Well, from a recent survey carried out by the Mental Health Foundation, we know that about 1 in 3 people in the UK who are currently in work are worried about losing their job. We know that a lot of those people might have been asked to work short hours by their employer at the moment. They might be seeing friends and colleagues around them being made redundant. A lot of those people will have been furloughed. About half of people in the UK who are unemployed are worried about having enough food, in the 6th richest country in the world. And a third of people, whether they're in work or not, are currently experiencing financial concerns. We know that the state have taken very drastic action to try and support income through this time. Of course, most recently this week, we've heard that the furlough scheme is being extended up into the autumn. We also know that a lot of people have been encouraged to apply for universal credit. But I think what we're really seeing is a great many people who have always been in a relatively stable financial position before, being pushed into the benefit system, which they probably had no prior experience of. It's a complicated system to navigate. It's not easy to get an application in. And when people do receive their first payment, I think a lot of people are quite surprised at just how little money you can be given through the benefit system. And this is affecting our mental health as well. I mean, I'm not sure, this stat, again, from that Mental Health Foundation survey, 6 in 10 adults in the UK have felt anxious or worried through the pandemic. I would love to meet the other 4 who haven't felt anxious or worried at any point during this experience. The word unprecedented is getting a lot of airtime lately because it is. None of us have ever been here before, and that uncertainty always will make us feel on edge, unsettled, and might affect how we cope with other challenges in our lives. So, Money and Mental Health are here to tackle a very set problem, which is about the link between mental health problems and financial difficulties. And why is that a link worth tackling? Well, because the figures are really striking. If you're experiencing a mental health problem, you are 3.5 times more likely to be in problem debt. And half of people with a debt problem also have a mental health problem. Across the UK, that adds up to 1.5 million people just in England experiencing both issues. And that was pre-crisis. So we're expecting the number of people affected by both these issues separately and by the combination of the two to increase quite significantly over the coming weeks, months, and even years. I mean, the economic impact of the current crisis will be something we live with for a long time to come. And so today, what I'm going to talk you through is the link between these two problems. It's complicated because they're self-reinforcing. Experiencing a mental health problem makes managing your money harder. It makes it harder to earn money, and it makes it harder to ask for help. That means you won't like to be in financial difficulty, and then the consequence of that financial difficulty, the stress of trying to make ends meet, the action that creditors might take against you, going without the essentials that you need every day, can again make your mental health worse. This can become a bit of a sort of doom spiral if we're not very careful. And so what Money and Mental Health is all about is trying to break this cycle and find ways to fix the problem. There's no single start point. in a cycle. So we're going to start on the right hand side because I think it's a bit easier to understand how financial difficulties can affect our mental health. Next slide, please. Skip to the one after that, actually. Thank you, Tim. So financial difficulties can generate a range of psychological responses. Things like feeling trapped, overwhelmed, a burden to others. We heard that in Jerome's story earlier, thinking that our families are going to have to fish us out of this mess somehow, often knowing they're not in a much better position themselves. And those can leave people feeling just hopeless, like there's no way out of the situation that they're in. These sort of feelings and thoughts can come in response to long-term financial difficulties. Persistent poverty and living with financial insecurity can really exhaust a person over time. And they can lead to social isolation if someone can't afford to keep up with the things or do the things that would help them feel well. And I think this quote, which I'm a member of Money and Mental Health's research community, a group of 5,000 people with lived experience of mental health problems who feed into everything that we do, I think this quote really sums up just what that can feel like. But there can also be sudden financial triggers as well, for people who were previously comfortable and then experience one of those very sudden financial shocks. That can be an unexpected cost that you can't afford. It could be aggressive collection practices or an income shock, whether it's a sanction on your benefits or losing work very quickly, can all lead to a very rapid downward spiral in this psychology and leave people feeling trapped and alone. Sadly, as Jerome's case shows us, that sometimes can lead to people considering taking their own life. A quarter of people who attempted suicide last year in England were in problem debt. And people in problem debt are 3 times as likely to have thought about suicide in the last year. When, if you were sitting inside a bank, about 3 in 100 of every customer that you were sending a collections letter to would go on to try to take their own life this year. That is truly a terrifying statistic. The relationship is very complicated, but it persists even after we've controlled for things like whether someone's in employment, for their gender and for their age. There is a very strong link between these two things. Happily, it's one we think we can do something about. But first, let's look at the other side of the problem. How does experiencing a mental health problem affect your finances? So the first way that mental health problems have a big impact on us is through our earnings. People living with mental health problems are much less likely to be in employment. So only about 4 in 10 people living with a mental health problem will be in work, compared to about 75% of the rest of the population. And what that means is obviously people are reliant on the benefit system for income, as I said earlier, not terribly generous, or savings. Quite a lot of people might retire early on grounds of ill health and then be reliant on whatever pension and savings they've managed to accumulate. That typically won't be generous if their working life was relatively short. Where people with mental health problems are in work, we know that people tend to be in more insecure forms of employment or employment that is paid less well. Often that is people having to make a choice about whether to prioritise their income or their health. So perhaps choosing a role with fewer responsibilities. We've heard from plenty of people who were in managerial positions who have since chosen to take a step or two down the ladder, to work a shorter week, to go part-time, to switch industry entirely, or to choose self-employment. So they have that control over the work that they're doing. These can be brilliant for supporting people's mental health. It can really mean people are able to make choices that work for them about where work fits into their life. But sadly, that does have an impact on people's income, and that then stacks through to how financially resilient people are when a crisis hits. Being unwell also costs us more money. So many people experiencing mental health problems will find contact with other people and social contact very difficult, and will struggle with low levels of energy and motivation. It's really important to sort of make clear that we understand this isn't about being lazy, it's about being unwell. And if someone was living with a physical health condition like cancer or a long-term brain injury, we wouldn't be calling people lazy for feeling that they were unable to cook from scratch every night, and relying instead on even things like pre-chopped vegetables to make cooking that bit easier, or convenience food where it was needed. For taking taxis if you couldn't face taking the bus today. Paying for medicines and treatments as well. Of course, in this country, we're enormously lucky to have the NHS, but waiting times for therapies in particular can be very long. And if you need medication like antidepressants to manage your mental health, those all come with an additional cost for prescription charge, which can be hard to manage if you're living on a lower income. And then there's the cost of things that help you stay well. So many people with mental health problems tell us that they find things like participating in craft or DIY activities, a book club or exercise, regular cinema visits are all really important to helping them have a sense of purpose in life, to finding things they enjoy and staying well. All of that comes with a cost too. And then the bit that I think is least explored, and where money and mental health have done lots and lots of research over the past few years. I think in this country we tend to think about mental health problems as being largely emotional. We think it's about feeling sad, having that black dog following you around, cloud over your head if we were painting cartoons. But actually mental health problems are illnesses of our brain. And like any other kind of illness of our brain, if it was dementia or another sort of physical brain problem, they affect the way that we think as well as the way that we feel. Mental health problems often affect our attention span. So it means the amount of time that you take to absorb information and make decisions based on it can be difficult to do, can make it affect our memory. So it's hard to remember when your bills are due or the details of a contract that you've agreed to, maybe for your broadband or your mobile telephone, because those are hideously complicated. It can make it hard to manage our behaviour, to concentrate on fixing problems, and to weigh up information when we have to make choices so that we make sure we're getting the best deal for us or choosing the right choice. And a lot of us are going to be facing this kind of challenge at the minute. If you're living with a mental health problem, it's probably even harder because you only have a certain amount of bandwidth inside your brain. And at the moment, quite a lot of that is probably quite reasonably busy with other things, worrying about getting enough food and essentials. This was absolutely top of the list when we talked to our research community a few weeks ago. Even though the supermarket shelves are filling up again, going out to the supermarket is still quite a stressful experience for many people. And people are still really worried about that. People with mental health problems are also telling us that they are really struggling to access mental health services at the minute. And if again, they relied on that support, whether it was therapy or some other kind of help to get them through the week, not having access to that can mean doing all the other practical things you need to do in life is much harder. Also, many of us worrying about our employment prospects and our job security, and about looming debt and financial issues. You might have been able to access a payment holiday for now, but what's going to happen to your mortgage in 4 or 6 months' time? All these worries press down on us, they take up space in our brain, and they make it harder to make decisions and to solve the problems that we're faced with. And so what does that mean in practice? Well, these are figures from a survey of over 5,000 people with mental health problems, and they paint a very stark picture of what those things can mean in practice for our financial behaviour. So nearly everyone who answered the survey told us that they spent more than usual when they were feeling unwell. That's not surprising. Lots of mental health problems affect our impulsivity and make it harder to hold back when we've found a temptation to buy something. If there's anyone out there who hasn't bought something they might not otherwise have bought in lockdown, I'd love to meet you. My silliest purchase is some plant pots. I haven't been able to get any compost, so I just have some empty plant pots. They are not making me feel better, but in the moment it felt like the thing that was going to help, so I paid the money for them. Arguably not my smartest choice. If I was experiencing a mental health condition, I might expect to see that on a much bigger scale, which could mean spending money I didn't have and might leave me in problems. Many people also tell us that they put off paying bills if the idea of opening that envelope, seeing the damage done, having to go through the process of making a payment was just too difficult, and avoided dealing with creditors, or even in some cases 6 in 10 borrowing money that they wouldn't otherwise have borrowed, sometimes feeling that panic, struggling to make the decision and feeling that it'd be better to take out a loan so there's some spare money in your account, even if you're not sure what it's for, and then finding 6 weeks later that money has magically disappeared on those little things that made you feel better, frittered away, leaving you with the debt to pay back. One area where we've particularly paid a lot of focus is the challenges people can face when dealing with essential services. So energy, telecoms, financial services, all those things we all have to deal with pretty much every day for modern life. And we know that 4 in 10 people who've experienced mental health problems feel really significant symptoms of anxiety when they have to deal with their services. So when they need to make a telephone call or deal with a bill or something like that. And these often express themselves physically. So hyperventilating, racing heart. We also lots of people who feel the need to procrastinate. So we'll have to write a long list of things before they can find the energy and the motivation to make that phone call that might help them resolve the problem. And communicating is a really common challenge. So 3/4 of people who've experienced mental health problems struggle to use at least one major form of communication channel. And more than half of people with mental health problems will struggle to use the telephone. Turns out this is really common across the population. Actually, about a third of us, I'm one of them, struggle to use the telephone for normal things. But it means if you have a problem with like your broadband or your bank account and you need to get in touch, or at the moment particularly you need to get in touch to ask for some extra help because you're struggling to make ends meet, that makes getting that support a lot harder. And so we can see that experiencing a mental health problem makes managing money harder, makes earning money harder, and makes it harder to ask for help, all of which mean you're more likely to end up in financial difficulty. Happily, there are things we can do about it. I explained some of the things we've changed already at the start, and at Money Mental Health, we've been working over the last few months and will continue to do so through the summer to try to deal with some of the really pressing issues that people are facing at the minute, particularly around the benefit system, making sure everyone can get access to the support that they need and deserve. We're also working with the government to try to change some of the letters that are sent to people who fall behind on bills so that they're less scary and people are more likely to get the help that they need. If you're interested in that campaign, I'd encourage you to go to the Money Mental Health website where you'll find a petition where you can support us. We'd be very grateful for any extra signatures, so we'll be handing that into the Treasury very soon. That's it for me for now, but I think we should hopefully have some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katie. That was absolutely fabulous, I think, and very timely. And there's a few questions coming in, and if I can just start with this one really, because there's a moral dimension. I didn't use the word in the presentation, but there's a moral dimension to debt which doesn't exist perhaps with other forms of mental health problems, like for instance schizophrenia or psychosis, to the same degree. It's a bit like somebody once said to me who was suffering from alcoholism. He said, it's the one illness where nobody sends you a get well soon card. And I think that one of the drivers, I think, that you've pointed out in the psychology of debt is people get driven into psychological and emotional isolation. Mm. And a lot of that is driven by shame and guilt. I mean, do you find that is very common, that shame and guilt become drivers of pushing people into isolation, which then exacerbates the problem?
Absolutely. I mean, and in some ways, to me, that encapsulates a very old-fashioned approach to debt and a lack of understanding about what the debt that most households in the UK are really dealing with is. I don't know about you, Peter, but I have vivid memories as a child of my nan, who is a proper Yorkshire matron, sort of telling me to never buy anything on Never Never, that, you know, getting into debt was a terrible thing and being in debt made you a terrible person, basically. And, you know, if you were a good person, you would save up and wait for the things that you wanted. And I think we tie that concept of debt to desire in our head. So if you're not, if you're borrowing money, it's for something you want, not something you need. That's not how credit works in the UK anymore. You know, actually the types of debt that are becoming more common in the UK at the moment are essentials. They are council tax arrears have increased dramatically, renting and house arrears, so either mortgage or rent payments people are falling behind on, and really essential bills like energy or your telephone bill, which arguably is a particularly essential service at the moment when we're not able to see our friends and family face to face, or we need that to do our work. So I think one of the things that will be really helpful for society, and I hope one of the things that we might get through this crisis in some ways, is a renewed understanding that actually problem debt isn't about people going wild on the catalogues. And it's very rarely about people, you know, borrowing to fund an addiction or something else. A lot of the time, it's people trying to give the families the essential things that they really need.
Or I think, like in Jerome's case, a young man trying to get his his foot on the economic ladder of life, as it were, at 19, wanting to earn, £1,500 a month, and imagining he could build himself a future doing that, and then obviously spiraling into debt, which then affected his mental and physical health. It's simply people wanting to make a go of their lives. And I think you're right. I think I'm glad you raised that point, that so much debt, as indeed was Jerome's problem, really, was got, if you want, in the process of trying to improve their lives, not squandering their lives, not wasting money, not buying from catalogs or buying too much on Amazon or spending too much money online. I think that's a really good point, because I think that also encourages and deepens the moral dimension of this, I think, because people then assume debt equals impulsive purchasing.
Yes.
And the point that you make, really, when you say what happens when people get into debt, they do become more impulsive. But then that's really simply a lack of clarity of thought, a lack of focus, which then spirals out of control. It's deepening the problem in order to try to solve the problem, I think.
That's it. Exactly that. We need to be so careful not to be judgmental of others and of ourselves, because particularly what's happening at the moment isn't anyone's fault. It's just life. Life happens and financial difficulty happens. And the important thing is how, as a society, we decide to deal with and support people who end up in these very difficult situations.
I think that's right. And I think that the more, I think the more punitive we become in these situations, perhaps, the more divided we become as a society, and the more people will disengage from the social fabric, if you want, and feel it has nothing to offer them, which then, of course, deepens the social unrest and the consequent social problems. But with Jerome's family, I mean, they've obviously taken on a campaigning role, if you want, now. What are they trying to do?
So the big thing that Jerome's family are campaigning for, together with a large coalition of charities across the debt advice and mental health sectors, is for independent regulation of bailiffs in the UK. So most people, I hope, probably haven't very much to do with bailiffs, and might not realise that actually the regulation of bailiffs in the UK is a little bit sketchy. There are rules they're meant to keep to about, so for example, Jerome's bike should never have been impounded. The rules are very clear that you don't take away someone's means of earning income. But clearly that bailiff didn't keep those rules. And this comes, so the problem we have is that there's no one independent enforcing those rules on the bailiffs. They're expected to sort of keep themselves in check. It's not working. We hear too many horror stories of people who are clearly unwell being treated in a way that frankly should shame all of us. And I think that independent regulation, which we've been inching towards with the government over quite a long period of time now, is really becoming increasingly urgent, as more people will end up in problem debt as a result of this crisis.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's an interesting question come in about the impact of the debt and mental health spiral on children.
Scary, isn't it? Thinking about little ones. I mean, children will pick up on the stress that the adults around them are feeling. So although most people will do everything in their power to protect their children, and particularly, we hear awful stories of mums and dads, going without food so that their kids eat and that sort of thing. But it's a matter of pride for a lot of people, isn't it, Peter? People don't want to be seen as to feel that they are failing their children. That they are failing to provide the uniforms, the school trips, all those other things that kids need. And that does have a real impact, because even if you think your kids aren't picking up on it, they probably are. Happily, support is out there. There are ways that you can talk to your children. And I'd really urge you to go look at Young Minds, who are a fantastic charity providing support to children and young people, if you have any worries at all.
Have you got a URL for Young Minds at all, or is it just Young Minds?
Share one later.
Okay, that would be great, because I think you're right. I mean, sometimes adults assume that children don't really know fully what's going on. I think often the contrary is the case. Children are like sponges. They'll pick up, on everything that's going on, all the emotional dynamics and the psychological dynamics that are happening within the family, and they'll pick up on them. And do you feel that are there any data you have on the impact of adult debt, if you want, on children?
I haven't got anything to hand. I know the Children's Society have done some work on this and do find that stress feeds through to children. So it is something to be aware of. I think the really important thing to take out of it, though, is that problem debt is solvable. If you have debts that you can't pay back, there are solutions out there. They're not as scary. Bankruptcy is a thing we're all terribly scared of, sometimes with good reason, but actually there are lots of modern debt solutions available. There are charities who will help free of charge, including Step Change, who can help you over the phone or by web chat, Citizens Advice, who equally can help online or over the telephone, and the Money Advice Trust, who run the National Debt Line, fantastic service. All of them can help. All of them are free. And if you are having problems, the best thing to do is actually deal with your debt, because they will be able to help. And then you can start moving forward and put the problem behind you.
It's interesting because having run homeless shelters myself and found a lot of people in those shelters who were there simply because one event led to another, much like your own story, and really people suddenly found themselves in circumstances they hadn't imagined, and a lot of that was because they were driven into isolation. They were frightened to ask for help, because they were driven into isolation, and I think that's really important. I think the isolation of this is something we can't emphasize enough. Really, when people suffer from mental health problems, shame and guilt impairs their ability to ask for help, and that in turn deepens the problem, which in turn further imparts their ability to ask for help, which in turn deepens the problem, and on and on we go. And then we do end up with situations like we discussed with Jerome. But in terms of mental health, do you think that how much people sometimes ask, are there pre-existing mental health issues that cause financial problems, or do financial problems cause mental health issues? What's the causality in this, or what's the ratio of causality?
It's both ways, and to be honest, I think it gets so complicated that I probably wouldn't want to try to put a statistical lens on that causality, because I think we just see it happen always up. And because these things tend to happen over time, something can start as a mental health problem, then become the financial difficulties worsening that, and then that financial difficulty causes more debt, and so trying to unpick it just doesn't work, because people's lives aren't that straightforward. It definitely does go both ways. So we certainly see some cases where people have got into problem debt where they wouldn't have done so if they'd been well. I think particularly bipolar disorder is one where we see quite a lot of difficulties in there, because a clinical symptom of bipolar disorder, one of the things the doctor would ask about if you went to see them about it, is spending. So that typically people experience kind of grandiose delusions about what their life could be, and can spend enormous volumes of money under the impression that the life they're leading is quite different to the reality that you and I are experiencing, Peter. And that can leave people in really, really serious difficulties, racking up thousands of pounds of debt nearly overnight, which is then very hard to untangle, unfortunately. But equally, we hear from plenty of people who, were doing okay, didn't have a lot of a buffer, were vulnerable in that respect, but were doing all right until something financially went wrong, and then things stacked up very quickly from there. I think one of the most important things for me is finding those little opportunities to help. So many of the opportunities to help with this, are not big dramatic policies. Debt happens, mental health problems happen. I can't prevent either of those things, full stop. But there are things we can do that make it easier for people to ask for help when they're getting into trouble. And that's why, sometimes I feel a bit silly. I spend an awful lot of my working life talking about letters. But actually, letters are really important, because they become one of those real triggers to fear and guilt. That letter lands on your doorstep, and at the moment it's often full of red text and capital letters that you interpret as being shouted at. And if there is signposting to help, it will be hidden on the back of page 3. So it might have those really helpful phone numbers, but so far down the list that you're never going to see them. Instead, you take a first look at the page, you see it shouting at you, turn it over, you put it in a drawer. I've heard people hiding letters in such places. My favourite was a lady who told us that she hides her letters underneath the sofa. And in my head, there's just this picture of her sofa sort of rising up over time under the weight of the letters underneath it. But that's what people do. If you talk to people who work as debt advisors, they tell you they can tell when someone's unwell when they first walk into their local Citizens Advice, because they'll be the ones that come with the biggest carrier bags full of letters that they've not opened.
I think that goes back to what you were saying before about people pay off putting bills or put off paying bills, and they avoid their creditors when they get into difficulty, because they want to pretend it's not happening. They just can't deal with it emotionally. But another question's come in about the situation we're in now. You mentioned earlier about how obviously the current situation is going to exacerbate the financial difficulties of millions of people really in this country, and of course many more all over the world. Within lockdown, right now, people are now in lockdown and they're feeling desperate and they feel like they need help. How do they go about it? What can they do now while everybody's locked away?
So debt advice services are still working. So if you're feeling desperate at home, please know help is there. Reach out and reach out today. These are fantastic, caring, fully trained professionals. They will listen to your problems and they will help you find practical solutions. They're all available online or over the telephone. So do reach out if you need help. If you're struggling with your mental health, again, the NHS is open and your GP will be available to talk to you about any mental health concerns that you're having, any symptoms that you're experiencing, and they will be able to offer you support. We did see some problems at the start of the crisis with things like access to therapy, but there are some brilliant online solutions out there and things are getting better in terms of access to secondary mental health services. And there's also an awful lot of things that you can do at home to look after yourself and try to support your own mental health. So things like getting a bit of exercise, giving yourself some purposeful activity to do, particularly if you're on furlough or if you've just lost your job. That period of transition and the sense of loss of purpose can be ever so difficult to manage. There is some fantastic guidance on Mind's website about the ways to deal with lockdown and the things you can do to support your mental health, and I'd really encourage actually everyone to have a look at that. I think it's brilliant. It certainly helped me manage, and I'm sure lots of other people will find it helpful too. But know that help is out there. You're really not alone.
And I think that's a good message to end on, really, that if people could realise they weren't alone, I think much of this problem could be, if not solved, at least it is helped significantly. And I'd just like to thank you, Katie, for it's been a fantastic contribution that I'm sure a lot of people will find useful. We'll be following up, to let everybody know, we'll be following this up with an email to all our participants today, and that will include links to some of the sources of help that you were talking about, Katie. So all that information we'll provide afterwards. So once again, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated, and thanks again. And just a final word for those of you who may be interested. I'm actually a panelist tonight on a webinar on the title being "Will the Pandemic Expose Our Climate Hypocrisy?" And it's been held by the Science Centre. In Life and Science Centre in Newcastle, and it's just asking whether we will change our behaviour as a result of the pandemic, or whether we will return to our old ways. So, again, more psychology and topical issues tonight, if you're interested. But once again, thank you very much indeed, Katie. Much appreciated.